I think that we should try everything all at once and see what sticks. And long term, it'll probably be a combination of all of the above, right? We will need better genomic integrity, DNA repair, better molecular machinery, better polymerases. We'll probably also need better mechanisms of eliminating senescent cells because none of these molecular machineries are ever going to be perfect. Like they're always going to have errors, and as those errors accumulate, eventually you will get senescent cells, and you will need to eliminate them.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of Follow Principle. I'm here today with Benjamin Arya. We met, I think, probably 6 months ago, a year ago, something like that.
Right.
And we had a very nice conversation about longevity. And I thought, why don't we continue that? Let's talk a little bit about longevity, about why this makes so much sense. And, to begin with, I love to, learn a little bit more about, your background, like, what is your story? How did you end up, getting into the longevity field?
Javier, first of all, good to be here. Good to see you again. Um, I think that's an interesting question because it's been a very long time that I've been interested in longevity. It started when I was quite young. Back in high school, I told everyone that I wanted to cure cancer and I wanted to make humans immortal. Like, I think I was like 12 years old, 13 years old, and I didn't know quite how to do it. But from a very young age, I felt the need to, extend lifespan and to work on things that are not incremental and have scalable impact. And yeah, I essentially didn't really have a community of people around me. I mean, there's not a lot of people in Australia interested in this, especially at the time as well. Being very young, there wasn't really people that actually felt that it was a feasible idea. But when I came to the US, I realized, wow, there's like hundreds of people in the space, and we've all kind of reached these conclusions or the same conclusion separately, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think humans in general have been interested in longevity and living for a long, long time for many years, right? I sometimes tell people the very first, I don't know, novel wasn't really a novel, right? Like the very first fiction story that was written was Gilgamesh, right? Which is just a story about a king in Uruk, I think it was, like former Iraq, who goes into this adventure, and then tries to find, some kind of source of, immortality. Um, and I think humans, I mean, people have been interested in this stuff for many, many, many years, right? So, I think the first question, right, that in my mind comes up when you talk with somebody about why longevity is like, how is it now different, right? Like, people have been interested in this for a long time. Why is it different now? Like, why can we actually do something about longevity or extending longevity now?
Hmm.
Um,
That's a great question. I feel like in some ways we don't know, right? It's possible that we're also 100 years early, and we need several advances in different fields of technology before we can make a true dent on maximum lifespan. But I think the premise of why there are so many people now going into the space, more than hundreds of years ago and in the past, is that biology is becoming engineerable. Right? We have these exponential growth trends in synthetic biology, machine learning, genetic engineering, gene delivery, and they're converging at the same time in a way that is making harnessing, oh, not really harnessing, but upgrading our genomes almost inevitable, right? That maybe it's out of reach right now, but in a few years, in a decade, a couple decades, we might be able to engineer our own biology and give us the features that other species have, right? We're not the longest lived species on the planet, and maybe we can look at nature for inspiration.
mhm. Yeah. I mean, I think there's two interesting points that you make, right? Like, so maybe let's touch on the first one. Um, there are other species that live a lot longer, right? Trees, I think, yeah, are maybe the longest lived, right? Like you have trees that live literally thousands of years, right? And even animals, there are animals that live hundreds of years as well. What is your I don't know, your favorite long-lived species?
Interesting. I don't think I have a favorite long-lived species. I just have a favorite, like, resilient species, which is the tardigrade. Um, yeah, I think most scientists in comparative biology are aware of a few species. The Greenland shark lives quite a long time. We know that the naked mole rat,
50 to 150 years or so.
something around there. The naked mole rat lives much longer than it should live based on its body mass. And the tardigrade is just incredibly radio tolerant. It can resist radiation. It can survive in the vacuum of space. Um, and just without the tools of genetics, we could look at these species and be amazed by them. But now that we can sequence their genomes and understand what each gene does, now that we have sort of perturb-seq and functional genomics, we can understand, oh, maybe it's these set of 5, 10, 20, 50 genes that are conferring these resistance to radiation, improved DNA repair, improved genomic integrity, extended lifespan. And what if we could bring these to humans? And that's the one of the things I'm interested in.
Yep, yep. I like squirrels. I think squirrels are interesting, right? Somebody made this comparison a while back that was very catchy. Squirrels are like rats with furry tails. But we somehow think, rats are disgusting, or squirrels are nice and cute. But squirrels are very, very similar to rats, right? But they would live 10 times longer. They look very similar. They're very similar in size, but I think a rat would live, 2, 3 years, right? And a squirrel would live, maybe 20 years. I mean, I don't know if anybody is, giving them IDs and checking their age, right? But I think they live much, much longer. And we don't really understand it very well, right? Like, the biology involved in why some species live a lot longer than others. Um, you mentioned uh, that nickel mole rats live a long time for their mass, right? Like, what does that mean? Let's get a little bit of detail, right? Like, why do um bigger animals normally live longer than smaller animals?
Yeah, I do think it's not a completely answered question for which we have broad consensus, but anyone can kind of look up a graph of the mass of the species and the extended lifespan, or the lifespan of that species on average. And it's a relatively linear line with like a few exceptions, one of them being the naked mole rat, where essentially the larger the species is, the animal is on average, the longer it tends to live. And I think the most dominant theory is that as these organisms grew to be larger organisms have more cells equals a higher chance that one of those cells develops into a cancer cell. And therefore, these organisms, as a byproduct of being larger, they had to develop enhanced sort of DNA repair and tumor suppressor genes that also just happen to confer a longer lifespan. That if you could maintain your genomic integrity in order to reduce cancer risk, that just as a byproduct, you also lived longer.
Yeah. I guess there's a little bit of evolutionary pressure somehow, right? The bigger an organism gets, the more it makes sense for that organism to live longer, right? Because of all the energy expenditure involved in building all those tissues, growing appetites, and so on, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's also like a bit of a chicken or the egg problem. Like, are these longer lived animals living longer because of these enhanced DNA repair mechanisms, or are these DNA repair mechanisms a byproduct of another evolved mechanism? We don't exactly know. Yeah.
I remember hearing a little bit about the bowhead whale. I think it is right. Like there's this one of these, humongous whales that can live a couple hundred years, right? In the wild, right? Which is also different than humans. If we had them, in an amusement park, fed them and then took care of them, gave them medicines, they may live even longer, right? It may not be, it may be more than 200 years, maybe 300, 400 years. We don't know that, right? I guess same as sharks. Um, okay, so that I think is very interesting, right? What can we learn from nature about what makes some species live longer than others? But I think the second interesting point is that we now have some ways of manipulating that, right? So like we have ways of taking an animal and making the animal, uh, which would be otherwise healthy, live longer, right? Like people do these experiments in worms and flies and mice and so on and so forth, right? So 100 years ago, we didn't know how to do that. And I guess now we do, right?
Yeah, yeah. The thing, the one challenge has been that we haven't found any small molecule drugs that can, you know, on a sort of broad consensus basis, extend maximum human lifespan. That's been a huge challenge. There's a lot of people working on sort of mouse models right now. Like the big challenge has been, can we just double mouse lifespan? No one has even been able to achieve that. And I think the problem is that we're still working with these bad genes, right? And like our genome is susceptible to entropy. That's a fundamental law of physics. And the molecular machinery that we have, our DNA repair mechanisms, our polymerases just make mistakes. They are proteins which are just kind of like wriggling around, right, in molecular soup. We sometimes imagine proteins to be these precise, molecular machines, but they're really just these floating, gooey things that happen to bump into each other the right way for certain things to happen, or to catalyze certain processes. And they're not stable. So they make mistakes. These mutations accumulate over the course of the lifespan. Every time you accumulate DNA damage, there are so many DNA repair pathways, but they all have their failure modes, right? And um, if you just let that play out over a long enough time, it's almost inevitable and obvious why we develop disease, and why we age, and why we get cancer.
Yeah. Um, I think that's fair enough, right? I'm not sure um, uh, I would, I mean, so it is 100% true, right? Like we haven't found a small molecule that increases maximum health span in humans, but we also haven't been able to run a clinical trial for it either, right? Whereas I think, unfortunately, we will be stuck doing experiments in animals for the foreseeable future, right? And it's true. I don't think anybody has been able to extend uh, lifespan in mice by 2x. But some people have done, 20%, 30%, 50%, right? Even with small molecules, right? So I think, I don't know, I guess it's, I'm a, glass half full kind of person instead of, glass half empty, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against small molecules. I think that there probably will be some small molecule drugs that are taken on a population level, mass market drugs like GLP-1s, but that sort of extend lifespan, and might also counteract some of the metabolic ill health that we experience because of the lifestyles that modern Western society tends to uh, lean us towards. Um, but I think the big long term advances are sort of, let's get to 10,000 years, 1,000 years. I think that necessarily will have to come from upgrading the human genome itself.
Yep. So let's go down a little bit into that, right? What could be the path for a therapeutic intervention that does that in humans? Would that have to be something that is done in an embryo, or can it be done on adults as well? Could it be used for people that are already at an advanced age today, or does it have to be done, very early in life? Like how, realistically, right? Like, what would be the way to even if we knew how to do it, right? Like, what would be the way to bring that to, real people, real patients?
Yeah, this is a great question. And to be honest, I'm just getting started, right, on the research journey to know what the right way is. So I'm only speaking from intuition here. One of the things that I'm really excited about is the sort of biomarkers of aging initiative uh, that has been really ramping up and basically trying to come up with what are the biomarkers or clinical endpoints that we're going to use in order to determine if an intervention or a drug is actually going to extend lifespan, given the fact that running a clinical trial that is the same length as the average human lifespan is going to be extremely expensive and also isn't going to get us results very fast, right? Like if we have to wait until everyone in the clinical trial dies or most people in the clinical trial die, then, the feedback loop on our intervention is going to be close to a generation. We don't want that. So, you know, I think step one on the validation side is like what biomarkers are going to act as proxies for likely extended lifespan and longevity and sort of other general health and well-being. Um, and then I think from that, we're going to get a bunch of small molecules that probably increase genomic integrity. We'll get some small molecules that improve metabolic health, some that might kind of activate transcription factors that orchestrate DNA repair and could sort of boost innate DNA repair mechanisms. Um, but then over the very long term, as I mentioned, we need to upgrade the molecular machinery. What does that look like? Well, there's, polymerases. We need to improve their replication fidelity so that they make less mistakes. That's obviously super difficult because they have multiple, about a dozen binding partners, each of the many different polymerase subtypes. Um, and then we also need to improve basically every single of the more than half a dozen DNA repair pathways that exist and the dozens of proteins that are involved in those pathways without disrupting the delicate molecular balance that occurs within cells.
Yeah.
I,
So
I
could that
I see that as the pathway.
Is that be a protein therapy, or it has to be a gene therapy? And also, can it be done in, like, so, with a lot of, I guess, so the way that people do sometimes these things in mice, right, is you get an embryo, you make the change in the embryo, and then you get a new, you know, line of mice that has a mutation, right? You can do that in humans, right? There are some, I guess, gene therapies that you could somehow apply on an embryo, right? Which makes it easier, right? But unfortunately, most of us are not embryos, right? Like, we're fully grown adults. We have lots of cells. You can't just make the change in one place, right? So, uh, I guess we would need some kind of gene therapy delivery mechanism, right? That may be able to bring this, novel DNA repair enzymes, to our cells, right?
Yeah, that's definitely true, and this is a big bottleneck for that we will have to overcome as a species before we can do this in adults, organism wide and somatic cells. But I think what the recent kind of direwolf colossal biosciences story showed us is that we do have the technology to create transgenic animals, and we do have multiplex genome engineering. And yes, currently it seems that it's illegal, and the international sort of science community is mostly against it. You saw that case of the Chinese scientist that spent 3 years in jail.
Hey, I think it's his name, something like that.
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce it, but, that was a pretty severe punishment for what a lot of people were kind of overlooking, right? I mean, many people knew that he was going to do that, both in China and in the US. No one really spoke up, but yet the news of it was so big, around the world that it could have started like a genome engineering race between China and the US, right? And, like, that punishment, like, the severe punishment could almost be interpreted as sort of, you know, Xi Jinping's attempt to remove the missiles from Cuba, right? Like a de-escalatory, let's stop a genome engineering war from happening right now between the two nations. Um, but yeah, like I think if we did as a society decide that it's a good idea to improve the genome of new children that are born, we could do that. We could edit a bunch of the genome, introduce some new genes from other species, and maybe that would increase lifespan. Of course, we'd have to validate that in other species first, but that's one approach. But then the other thing you mentioned was around, can we do this in adults? Right now we can't, but I think is a lot of there is a lot of need for non-incremental advances in gene delivery. Like one of the approaches I am interested in is a sort of safe harbor lock and key approach where, what if we actually delivered a sort of lock to every single cell in the human body that would make further sort of upgrades easier, if that makes sense.
Um, how can you go into a little bit more detail? Like what would that be? Like how would that work? Would do some kind of, I don't know, nanobody that releases medicine, or with some kind of, I don't know, you know, like what is exactly what you would be suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't my idea, and I haven't, done a lot of research in this area at all. But the sort of general premise is that without a very simple, well, not a simple, but without a systemic uh, ability to access every single cell at the same time,
Yep.
we're always going to be relying on the properties of lipid nanoparticles, and we're going to have these sort of toxicity effects. But if we first attempt to introduce a kind of like a lock to each cell, um, then future gene therapies could be introduced where the sort of um, the gene therapy that we give to the patient would contain some kind of a key that allows it to fuse to the cell and deliver the sort of genetic material, but in a way that is safe and in a way that is cell specific. Each cell would potentially have a different lock, or each cell type or tissue type would have a different lock. And so it would kind of allow us to turn our body into like a very targeted gene delivery system.
Yeah. Let me try to rephrase it in a way that is maybe suitable also for like people that are not experts in biochemistry, right? So,
Sure.
uh, most medicines today, right, are small molecules, right? Which kind of the name small molecule can be a little bit misleading, but they are small in size, and that means that many of them can actually cross the membrane of cells, so they can be absorbed. So what happens when you eat the medicine, you eat aspirin, right? Then that goes to the stomach, is absorbed, it eventually ends up in blood, and then once it's in blood, it's circulated all over the body, and then sometimes it's absorbed in the cells. Now, with gene therapies, you can't do that because the gene therapy, the kind of the pill or whatever you take would be digested, right? So it would have to be somehow delivered in a different way, right? And also these molecules are, DNA or mRNA molecules, right? Like they are much bigger, so they don't just get inside of cells, right? So the trick would be to create some kind of like little, how would I say it? Like a lipid nanoparticle, like people use with the COVID vaccine or some other kind of, exosome, looking, kind of, particles, so that the uh, the the particle itself is absorbed inside of the cell, and then this really large molecule can go inside and do its effect. But now those lipid nanoparticles, or at least as we know them today, they don't really get distributed very well throughout the whole body, right? Like we don't know how to do that yet. So what you're suggesting is like you would have some kind of I don't know, protein in the surface of the cell or some kind of, marker inside of, or on the surface of every human cell, and then have another kind of lipid nanoparticle or something else that would bind to it so that when it binds, the therapeutic molecule would get inside of the cell. And then if you had this, then you could arguably distribute this gene therapy to every single human cell, right? Much more reliably than we can today. But did I get the gist of it?
Yeah, yeah, essentially. Again, this isn't my idea, and there's others that are much more experts on gene therapy than me. But essentially, you want to make sure that each cell gets one lock, right, and no more, so that in the future, when you want to deliver genetic material to all of your cells, you can ensure that each cell only gets one copy of that genetic material because there's only one lock, or whatever that lock is, whether it's a protein or like a cell surface protein or something. But that lock kind of allows the gene therapy to bind to the cell, fuse to the cell, release the genetic material inside in like a scalable way that you can do organism wide.
Yeah. Um, maybe switching gears a little bit, right? Like we talked about DNA integrity, uh, which is uh, which is an issue for humans because we are longer lived species. Many of us may end up developing cancer. Um, and um, the body, human cells have already developed some ways of dealing with that, right? So, we have, our immune system that sometimes, detects cancers and gets rid of them. We also have this mechanism called senescence, right? In which cells, may detect that they are becoming cancerous, and then they kind of, enter into this state where they don't replicate anymore. One of the interesting things that happened in longevity, I guess, over the past few decades is we kind of discovered how to remove, these senescent cells, right? Um, and you know, I wonder, if uh, you know, that would be another avenue, right? That may be easier, for example, than gene engineering to improve DNA integrity, right? So if we could somehow correctly identify some of these senescent cells, or somehow use maybe a small molecule to help potentially cancerous cells to become senescent, and then eliminate those senescent cells. Wouldn't that solve the same issues, right, with potential cancer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against any of the other approaches to lifespan extension. I think that we should try everything all at once and see what sticks. And long term, it'll probably be a combination of all of the above, right? We will need better genomic integrity, DNA repair, better molecular machinery, better polymerases. We'll probably also need better mechanisms of eliminating senescent cells because none of these molecular machineries are ever going to be perfect. Like they're always going to have errors, and as those errors accumulate, eventually you will get senescent cells, and you will need to eliminate them. Um, and we'll also need those sort of metabolic engineering drugs to make sure that we don't get fats, and make sure that our liver doesn't get cirrhosed, and make sure that we're going to get insulin resistance. So I think all of the above, all at the same time, um, gives us a good chance of, getting a good increase in lifespan.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that I think sometimes it's kind of hard to explain, right? Like, people outside of the field sometimes think that there's going to be this, silver bullet, right? Or the, magical molecule that is going to cure all your things. And that's just, not going to happen, right? In some ways, I really like the analogy that I think Omri de Grey, put years ago. If you think about a car, if you maintain that car, that car will last for much, much longer, right? But maintaining that car is not just putting oil, right? You have to replace the brakes, you have to clean up things, you have to change the air filter, the oil filter, and you have to do all sorts of other things. So then I think, um, extending longevity is probably going to be very similar, right? Like you'll have to remove all the detritus that accumulates, inside of cells and outside of cells, and prevent the risk of cancer and prevent, mitochondrial malfunction and so on and so forth, right? I mean, if anything, the risk of DNA mutations in mitochondria is even worse than potential DNA mutations, I guess, in the nucleus, right? Because the mitochondria have less of the, I guess, error prevention mechanisms, right? And there's is a more oxidative environment, from what I understand.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but I think the thing that's clear is we want to make sure that the reactive oxygen species environment in mitochondria is minimized as much as possible. Um, that not only damages mitochondrial biogenesis, but also the other like various biomolecules that are floating in the cell. Right?
Yeah, yeah. I remember reading a paper last year. It was very, very interesting. It was talking about how, um, I mean, some of these things are well understood, others a little bit less, right? But it was talking about how sometimes mitochondria malfunction in neurons, and then the mitochondria ends up breaking, which the membrane ends up breaking, and then that ends up leading to release of uh, DNA, right? What is it? Single stranded mitochondrial DNA, is single stranded. I don't remember exactly, right?
I
So
actually don't remember either. Yeah.
yeah, so ends up releasing that DNA in the cytosol of the cell, and then of course the kind of immune system, of the cell ends up reacting very violently to that, and then maybe one of the causes of um, senescence, in particular senescence in the brain. And in this case, what they showed was basically how they were able to induce that mitochondria to malfunction, and then they were able to detect markers of senescence. And in normal cells in the body, right, a lot of this stuff, is maybe less relevant because that cell, can be cleaned up or whatever. But in the brain, of course, you cannot, you know, remove neurons, right? Like, once it's gone, right? Or it stays that and malfunctions and then, brings everything else up with it, right? It's maybe one of the reasons why it's so insidious, right? Why neurodegenerative disease, is maybe a little bit harder than other diseases that affect other parts of the body.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really difficult one to address. If you project out the sort of incidence curves for neurodegenerative disease, pretty much everyone develops Alzheimer's by age 125. Like even if you avoid cancer and heart disease and metabolic disease and accidents, you will end up uh, developing Alzheimer's disease and eventually dying from neurodegenerative disease. So yeah, I think it's more important for sort of terminally differentiated cells like neurons to have incredible DNA repair, genomic integrity, and mechanisms of preventing epigenetic drift. Because those really need it. Like they can't afford to become senescent. Yeah.
Yep. Actually, a few weeks ago, I had Christine Glorioso from NeuroH, who talked a little bit about neurodegenerative disease, and her company, of course, is working on an aging clock for the brain, which I think is very, very interesting. I don't think that a lot of I think some genetic clocks are tissue specific, right? But most of them are just systemic, if I remember right. So I think one of the interesting things of what they are working on is this is specific to the brain.
Yeah. And that's important, right? Because again, kind of like with the biomarkers of aging consortium that you mentioned earlier, without, these proxy measures of whether it's brain age or, whole organism age, none of these interventions will ever be approved by the FDA, and no one will ever have the patience or the capital to run a clinical trial that lasts as long as the average human lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I completely agree, right? I think in some ways, the way that we fund science and drug discovery is broken, which makes it so hard to do things that otherwise would be a no-brainer, right? Like, you would imagine that after getting this initial proof that we can intervene in longevity, there will be budgets allocated to it, and people will be coming up with different therapies, and hopefully raising money, making money, helping people live longer. And that seems to be one of the big challenges in the field. There's a lot of ideas, but there's nowhere near as much budget to develop those ideas as you would imagine. Like people would go and spend, billions of dollars on obesity, right? And they would not spend, a fraction of that on things that are arguably going to kill or affect a lot more people.
Yeah, I do agree that it's broken in the sense that right now you have to have some initial clinical indication that the FDA labels as a disease in order to develop a drug. And by that very nature, no investor is going to fund you to develop a drug for a disease that the FDA has not labeled as a disease, right? Which is aging is not classified as a disease. It's considered a natural sort of part of the organism lifespan. Um, and until that changes, it's going to be difficult to bring these kinds of drugs to market. But I don't think that should deter anyone either, because we've seen the sort of Ozempic playbook, right? You develop a drug for a clinical indication that is kind of maybe rare or that is quite important and that you can get approval for. And then the drug either happens to, or, you know, uh, maybe it's a happy accident, or maybe you intend it to actually solve for a different, maybe more widespread disease that the FDA has not yet classified as a disease, or for which insurance does not cover. But eventually, when you get the drug into the hands of enough people, and they realize, wow, they can improve their life with it. They can reduce their, metabolic or improve their metabolic health with it. A lot of people will make that decision, and doctors will start to prescribe it off label. And I think that that will be the trajectory for a lot of longevity drugs, right? Like the most obvious playbook that I see, which a friend of mine, Alan Tamusiak, is
Mhm.
doing at the moment, is like creating a small molecule to improve genomic integrity in order to prevent cancer or to deal with sort of certain cancer predisposition genotypes, right? Certain sort of rare diseases that increase your likelihood of getting cancer. But when you get it approved for one of those conditions, well, the genomic integrity drug is also going to improve your lifespan, right? And maybe that's an avenue for broader mass market adoption.
Yep. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I really like that approach as well. One of my favorite companies is Repair Bio, and it's following a little bit of the same approach, right? Like they're working on um, I think it's essentially a, a, a protein therapy, uh, for removing cholesterol plaque, and uh, they are initially targeting familial hypercholesterolemia, right? Which is, I guess, rare disease that people have, where they have much, much higher cholesterol. They end up dying of cardiovascular disease earlier than most people. Yeah, but the idea, of course, is, well, if you have a therapy that successfully removes atherosclerotic plaque, then, and it has, very little or no side effects, then why wouldn't just everybody take it, right? And avoid the risk of having a heart attack or a stroke, right? Which would also affect, many, many, many of us. Is the first cause of death, definitely in Western countries, right? Either heart attacks or strokes, kill more people than anything else today, right? So if you had that therapy, why wouldn't you take it, even if it's just preventatively, right? And I think that's, that in my mind, that's probably the most promising approach for longevity therapeutics today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also speaks to an avenue that longevity therapeutics are probably going to have in the future, which is that the FDA considers cardiovascular and cardiometabolic illnesses a disease, and preventing them or kind of reversing certain biomarkers of that disease, like LDL cholesterol, is an activity that you can get a drug approved for. We have statins, for example, and they have questionable effectiveness on like a population health level, but
Yep.
they are approved. And I think once
But
we
without that,
recognize that
they make billions of dollars. Yeah.
exactly, I think once we recognize that aging is also a disease, then um, these kind of preventative medications that target the hallmarks of aging will also potentially be approved. But I absolutely love what Repair Bio is doing. I think it's necessary, as you mentioned. I mean, like cardiovascular diseases. I'm pretty sure that the number one cause of death in adults in the U.S.
It is.
Yeah, even more than
Pretty pretty much all the Western world, right? Yeah, yeah. More than all cancers put together, if I remember right. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I think in my mind, you know, at least there's things that you can do from the lifestyle side of things. Right? Like you could have a very healthy lifestyle that will minimize a lot of the potential from dying from uh, cardiovascular disease. You can do a little bit of that in cancer too. Like definitely avoid a lot of cancers. The thing that really scares me is the neurodegenerative disease. Right? I think in some ways that is going to be the real problem with developing longevity therapeutics, right? Like how do we actually, go beyond that? That's why, what you said about uh, if you trace the curves, eventually everybody would end up developing some type of neurodegenerative disease by age 125, right? Like once we, get there, right? That is very scary. Yeah, because also like you know, I think we understand a little bit more about cardiovascular disease, right? Like we don't understand cancer completely, right? But cancer survival rates have become much better, right? But well, we literally have nothing for most neurodegenerative diseases, right? Like there's we couldn't even understand the fundamentals of some of these diseases at all.
yeah, it's that there isn't broad consensus still on a lot of these neurodegenerative diseases, and especially how to address them. There are people working on it, which yeah, as you mentioned with the sort of glass half full, I hope to think that they're going to be successful and that maybe a cure to Alzheimer's is around the corner. But I think fundamentally it requires more than just addressing each of these neurodegenerative diseases by themselves and trying to categorize them and address their underlying pathophysiology. I think more broadly, we need to look at how do we upgrade these cells, but also how do we upgrade the extracellular machinery that degrades the metabolic byproducts for which we do not have intrinsic enzymes capable of doing so, partly because, evolution has not demanded that of us, right? Like, I think all of the problems that we have from a health perspective can be fundamentally traced to the concept that the evolutionary selective pressures to develop or evolve some of these molecular machineries that we would need in order to live for longer, that we would need in order to be healthy in our sort of obesogenic environments with the Western diet and our sedentary lifestyles, we don't have them. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be open to giving ourselves what evolution has not granted us.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Uh, we also, we evolved in an environment where, most of us or many of us would die of infectious disease, right? And then we came up with antibiotics, so now we don't die of infectious disease, right? I mean, evolution was able to uh, start tackling that problem. We have like immensely complex immune systems, right? But it wasn't until we discovered, antibiotics and so on and so forth, right? Like that we were able to avoid, most of the deaths from infectious disease, too, right?
Exactly. I think it's interesting that a lot of the arguments against sort of transhumanism and upgrading our biology and developing anti-aging drugs could also have applied to not developing antibiotics and vaccines. I mean, like it's natural to get infected and natural to die at a young age and have high infant mortality, but we didn't accept that as a civilization then, and I don't think we should accept it.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, like literally last week I was talking with Jonas Stokes, right? And I had him in the podcast as well. We were talking a little bit about antibiotics, and his team has done amazing research using AI to find novel antibiotics. I think that is, maybe a little bit, different from the longevity field, but it's also a major challenge for humanity as a whole, right? Like, the last, he said the last major antibiotic was found in the 80s, and we haven't been able to find anything since then. And now we have increasing cases of antibiotic resistant bacteria, across many, many different types of strains of bacteria. And, hopefully that won't be an issue, but I suspect it will be something that humanity will have to face over the coming, decades and centuries.
Mm.
Um, and but moving on, back to longevity, we're like, I'd love to, maybe just, close on, a little bit like, what are you working on? What are you excited about? What are the, what is next for you? Like, what are the kinds of things that you're spending your time on these days?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and this is one I don't have a great answer for because I'm still trying to figure it out, right? Um, I think it's important to improve DNA repair. That's probably in my opinion, the most important lever we can pull in the sort of foreseeable future on maximum lifespan. So that's what I am planning on, getting more involved in. At the moment, I'm just looking for it's basically better DNA repair machinery in other species, looking into protein engineering to optimize the replication fidelity of polymerases without disturbing their delicate binding partner sort of symbioses. Um, and yeah, just yeah, those are the main priorities. We'll see how they evolve. But eventually, I'd like to start a company in the space once I am confident that we have something or we have a pathway to market that is actually going to extend lifespan. And, I'm always looking to connect with people that are interested in the same thing and believe in the same thing and have sort of complementary inadequacies and experiences. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think it's very interesting, and of course, as you know, and myself and the rest of the team at Poland, we're like, we're working on a platform, right, to come up with novel therapeutics, right? So if at some point, we can help, with this idea of, how could we, help find a small molecule that improves replication accuracy. I'd love to, talk a little bit more about that. But I think we're kind of, coming up to the, 45, 50 minute mark. I think this is fairly, very, very interesting, fairly complicated, kind of discussion. I don't know how many people will listen to the end and understand everything, maybe outside of, folks within the longevity field. But I thought it was super, super interesting. So, thank you so much for taking the time. And I hope it was interesting for you as well.
I appreciate it, Javier. I hope I haven't made a fool of myself, but I expect that in sort of 5, 10 years, when I look back on this conversation, a lot of the things that I've said will have made no sense to me whatsoever. So we'll see.
Not at all, but yeah, no, I mean, like maybe a year from now we'll talk again, and you'll telling me about the company that you started and the therapies that you're developing, and hopefully with some path to actually developing a longevity drug, and then we'll look at it and say, well, it came a long way, right, over the past X years or whatnot.
Well, let's hope so. Well, it was a pleasure to come on your show.
It was my pleasure, Benjamin. Thank you so much.